The night my daughter-in-law grabbed my son's wrist and twisted it behind his back at the dinner table, she was smiling the whole time. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed smile. A smile that said she had done this before, and she had never once been told to stop. I watched it happen from across the table. My son, 34 years old, 6 feet tall, a man who used to climb oak trees in our backyard barefoot, went completely still. He didn't pull away. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at his plate like he was waiting for it to be over. Her mother laughed. Actually, laughed. She picked up her wine glass and said, "Oh, that's just how she keeps him in line. Every man needs a little managing, don't you think, Walter?" She looked right at me when she said it. I put my fork down. I folded my napkin. I said, "Excuse me for a moment," and I walked to the back porch. And I made a phone call that changed everything. My name is Walter Kane. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county bridges, drainage systems, road infrastructure. Nothing glamorous. The kind of work nobody thinks about until something breaks. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a bad knee, and more favors owed to me across this county than most people collect in a lifetime. I live alone now. My wife Ruth passed 6 years ago, breast cancer, 17 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, it was just me and my son, Daniel. He's the kind of person who calls just to check in, who remembers that you mentioned being tired last Tuesday and asks about it the following week. He got that from his mother. When Daniel told me he was getting serious about a woman named Christine, I was happy for him. He'd been careful after a painful breakup in his late 20s, and I could see how much lighter he seemed when he talked about her. I wanted to be open-minded. I wanted to be the kind of father who welcomed whoever his son loved. But the first time I had dinner with Christine and her family, something in the back of my neck went tight and didn't let go all night. Her father, Glenn, was loud in the way some men are loud when they want you to know they're important. He'd made money in commercial real estate and talked about it the way other people talk about surviving a war, like it had tested him and he'd been found worthy. Her mother, Diane, laughed at everything Glenn said and said very little on her own. And Christine was charming in a way I couldn't quite get comfortable with. She was always performing. Always the right amount of warm, the right amount of funny, the right amount of interested in whatever you were saying. It was like watching someone run a very polished program. I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was protective of Daniel in ways I wasn't always aware of. I kept my concerns to myself. They got married the following spring. The first year was fine, or at least it looked fine from where I was standing. Daniel and Christine bought a house 20 minutes from mine, in the same county. We had Sunday dinners every few weeks. I watched the way they were together and told myself the tightness in my neck was just old habit, just a widower who didn't know how to share his son. It was small things at first. Christine interrupting Daniel when he was mid-sentence, then acting like he'd lost his train of thought on his own. Christine deciding what they were doing on weekends and telling Daniel afterward, in front of me, the way you might tell a dog where you were going for a walk, Daniel laughing it off. Daniel saying, "She's better at planning than I am." Daniel shrinking himself down to fit whatever shape she needed him to be that day. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself every marriage has its private language and its private agreements, and it wasn't my place to translate. Then about 8 months in, Daniel stopped calling as often. When I reached out, he was always vague about his schedule, always checking with Christine before he could confirm anything. He missed my birthday dinner first time in 34 years because she'd planned a trip that weekend and hadn't told him until 2 days before. He apologized 6 times in a single voicemail. I heard the apology under the apology, the one he didn't know he was leaving. I drove over, unannounced, one Saturday morning. Daniel answered the door in a way that wasn't quite right, a half second of something moving across his face before the smile came up. Relief and anxiety at the same time. The way a person looks when something they've been hoping for arrives at a moment, it could also make things worse. Christine appeared behind him almost immediately. "Walter, we weren't expecting you." She said it pleasantly, but she was standing in the doorway of her own kitchen like a border checkpoint. We had coffee. She was in the room for all of it. When I left, Daniel walked me to my truck, and for a moment, standing in the driveway, he looked like he was going to say something. Then he looked back at the front window, and he didn't. I drove home and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I knew what I'd seen. I'd just spent 31 years learning how to look at structures and identify the points where the load was too heavy, where the material was starting to give, where something would eventually fail. I knew what stress looked like in things that were built to hold up under pressure. My son was being broken down, slowly, methodically, by someone who was very good at making it look like nothing was happening. I didn't panic. That's the thing about getting older. You learn that panic is just energy spent on the wrong frequency. You learn to go quiet and observe instead. I started paying closer attention. I made a point of seeing Daniel every 2 weeks, always in low-stakes settings, always somewhere Christine didn't feel threatened enough to monitor too carefully. Lunch at the diner near his office. A Saturday afternoon at the hardware store when he mentioned he was replacing a faucet. Small, ordinary time. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to see the shape of it. Christine controlled the finances. Daniel had a joint account with her, but his paycheck was direct deposited, and she managed everything from there. He had to ask for money for things he considered personal lunch with a coworker, a new pair of work boots. He said it so casually that I almost missed it. She's better with numbers than I am. Same language, same self-erasure. She'd cut him off from most of his friends. Not dramatically, she never forbade anything out loud. She just made other plans on the nights he'd mentioned wanting to get together with someone, or expressed mild displeasure that he always prioritized everyone else, until his social life narrowed down to her family and their couples, friends, all of whom she'd chosen. She checked his phone. He'd mentioned it once as a joke, then looked like he regretted saying it. I also noticed things I could see on the outside. The way he flinched slightly if she moved toward him quickly. The way he preemptively apologized for things that hadn't happened yet. The way he had stopped having opinions about anything in front of her, what restaurant, what movie, what color, to paint the living room, and then looked at her face to find out what he thought. I recognized it. In 31 years of field work, I'd gone out after floods and assessed damaged infrastructure bridges, culverts, retaining walls. The damage from sudden catastrophic force looks different from the damage done by sustained pressure over time. Slow damage is quieter, harder to see, more dangerous, in some ways, because it happens before anyone sounds an alarm. I also recognized it because I had read about it. After Ruth died, when I was trying to understand how grief worked and why some people recovered from hard things and some people didn't, I'd read more books than I'd read in the previous 30 years. Some of them were about psychology. Some of them were about family systems, about the patterns people fall into, about what it means to grow up in a house where love comes with conditions and control. I was a 60-year-old engineer from a county in the rural mid-Atlantic, and I had accidentally become better read on coercive control than most people I knew. I knew what was happening to my son. The question was what to do about it in a way that would actually help him, and not just relieve my own need to act. Here's what most people get wrong about situations like this. They think the right move is to confront it directly. Tell the person what you see. Make them choose. Force the issue into the open. I understand why that feels right. When someone you love is being hurt, the instinct is to name it loudly, to step between them and the thing that's hurting them, to make it stop through sheer force of will. But it doesn't work. Not with this kind of damage. When someone has been systematically cut off, slowly reshaped, taught to doubt their own perception of reality, confronting it directly just confirms the story they've been told about you. That you're controlling. That you're the problem. That they need to be protected from your interference. I'd seen it happen to other families. I'd watched fathers and mothers and friends push too hard and get pushed completely out of a life they were trying to protect. So I did something different. I waited. I built. I kept showing up. Every 2 weeks. Ordinary time. No pressure. I made sure Daniel knew he could call me at any hour without it needing to be an emergency. I never said a negative word about Christine directly, not because I believed in staying neutral, but because I knew that any ammunition I gave her would be used against the relationship I was trying to maintain with my son. And I started quietly gathering information, because I had learned from years of infrastructure assessments, from accident reports and failure analyses, that if you want to address a problem at its root, you need to understand its full scope first. I have a friend named Phil who retired from the county sheriff's department about 5 years ago. We go back 30 years. I helped his department with a drainage issue on their training facility, and he helped me navigate a bureaucratic nightmare with a bridge project on the county line. Phil is the kind of man who knows everything about everyone in a 20-mile radius and has the judgment to know what to do with what he knows. I called Phil and told him what I was seeing, not to ask for anything illegal, just to ask if he knew anything about Glenn, Christine's father, or their family. Sometimes patterns are inherited. Sometimes understanding where a person came from tells you a great deal about where they're headed. What Phil told me wasn't criminal, but it was instructive. Glenn had been investigated twice for financial misconduct related to his real estate business, nothing that led to charges, but enough to establish a pattern. There was a former business partner who had settled a dispute quietly under terms that included a non-disclosure agreement. Glenn ran his family the same way he ran his business. Tight control, selective information, punish any defection. Christine had grown up watching that. She had learned it the way children learn their first language. This wasn't an excuse. Understanding something is not the same as excusing it. But it helped me understand the full weight of what I was dealing with, not just a difficult daughter-in-law, but a woman who had been trained since childhood to operate this way and had never once been required to stop. About 11 months into the marriage, Christine's family began hosting a monthly Sunday dinner at Glenn and Diane's house. It was presented as a tradition they'd always had, though Daniel mentioned it started after the wedding. I was invited occasionally, clearly as a courtesy. I went, because showing up matters, and because you learn more by being present than by being principled about your absence. It was at one of those dinners, a Sunday in late October, the kind of evening where it gets dark early and everyone is a little edgy from the change in season, that everything broke open. We were seated around a large dining room table, Glenn and Diane at the heads, Christine and Daniel across from me, Christine's younger sister and her husband to my left. There was wine. There was a roast that Diane had clearly worked on for hours. There was the usual performance of a normal family dinner, which I had learned to read for its undercurrents. Daniel had mentioned earlier in the week that he was thinking about taking on a freelance project, some technical writing for a former colleague, a few hours a week, decent extra money. He'd seemed lighter talking about it, the way he used to seem when he had something of his own he was working on. At dinner, he mentioned it again. He said it almost cautiously, like he was testing the water temperature before he stepped in. Christine stopped him mid-sentence. She reached across and put her hand over his wrist, and I watched her grip tighten. "We already talked about this," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly social, the kind of calm that is its own kind of threat. "I know, I just thought—" "We talked about it," she squeezed. I watched his hand go white at the knuckles. Glenn chuckled at the head of the table. "Sounds like someone's got his answer." Diane smiled into her wine glass. Daniel looked down. He said, "You're right, sorry." He said sorry, to the table, to no one in particular. He said sorry for having mentioned something that was his own. I felt something go very still and very cold in my chest. I looked at my son's face, at the practiced blankness of it, the careful absence of expression that a person learns when they've been punished enough times for having one, and I recognized it. Not from anything I'd read, from something older. From the year after Ruth was diagnosed, when I used to watch her in the mornings trying to decide how much energy she had, and whether it was worth spending on an argument about whether I was overprotecting her. That particular kind of resignation. That particular shape of a person trying to take up less space than they're owed. I put my napkin on the table. I said, "Excuse me for a moment." I walked through the kitchen, out the back door, and I stood on Glenn's back porch in the October dark, and I called my son's former therapist. I need to explain that. Daniel had seen a therapist for about 2 years after Ruth died, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who worked out of an office in the next town over. He'd stopped going about a year before he met Christine. He'd never said why, just that he felt like he'd gotten what he needed from it. I had met Dr. Okafor twice. Once, when Daniel first started seeing her and wanted me to come in for a session, something about family context, understanding his background. Once, when she called me a few months in, with Daniel's permission, to share some observations and ask me some questions about Ruth's illness and Daniel's role in it. She was one of the most perceptive people I'd ever spoken with. And I had saved her number. I called her that night because I knew that what I was watching happen to my son was not a problem I could solve with a lawsuit or a conversation, or a confrontation at the right moment. What was happening to Daniel was happening on the inside. And the only way to reach something happening on the inside is through a door the person opens from their own side. Dr. Okafor didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I said my name, said I'd met her in connection with my son, Daniel Kane, and asked if she would be willing to speak with me at her earliest convenience. I said it was important. Then I walked back inside. I sat back down at the table. I finished my dinner. I spoke pleasantly to everyone around me, and I started thinking very carefully about the next few months. Dr. Okafor called me back the following Tuesday. She listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Has Daniel indicated any awareness that something is wrong?" I thought about the driveway, the half-step toward me, and the look back at the window. "Not in words," I said, "but yes." She said, "That matters. A great deal." She explained something to me that I already roughly understood but needed to hear stated precisely. That when someone is in a coercively controlling relationship, external pressure from family, from friends, from anyone outside almost always backfires, unless the person themselves has already begun to question the relationship. The questioning has to start from the inside. The outside can only hold the door open. She agreed to reach out to Daniel directly. She said she'd been thinking about him anyway. She occasionally checked in with former clients she'd worked with through significant grief, particularly around anniversaries. She would reach out around the anniversary of Ruth's passing, which was coming up in a few weeks, under completely natural circumstances. She also gave me what I can only describe as a roadmap. Not instructions, she was careful about that, about the appropriate boundaries of her role. But she helped me understand what a person in Daniel's situation needs from the people around them. Consistency, patience, the knowledge that there is somewhere safe to land, not pressure, not ultimatums, not the forced choice between his marriage and his father. Just the absolute certainty that I would be there, unchanged, whenever he was ready. I thanked her. I wrote down everything she'd said. I went for a walk around my neighborhood in the dark, and I thought about Ruth, about what she would have done, about whether I was doing the right thing. I decided that she would have been more graceful about it than I was being, and that I should try harder. Over the next 3 months, I did 4 things. First, I kept showing up. Lunch, hardware store runs. A Saturday afternoon replacing a section of rotted fence at my house that I didn't actually need help with, but that I knew Daniel would want to be useful for. I did not mention what I had seen at the dinner table. I did not mention Christine except neutrally, in passing. I talked to my son about the things we had always talked about, the county project he'd heard about on the news, the bird feeder I was trying to keep the squirrels out of, the book I was reading. Ordinary time. Consistent presence. Second, I called Phil again and asked him something more specific. I asked whether there was any financial irregularity in how Glenn's business had been transferred partially to a LLC that listed Christine as a stakeholder. Phil made some calls. What he found wasn't criminal on its face, but it suggested that Glenn had been quietly building a financial structure around his daughter in a way that gave him ongoing leverage over her life and, by extension, over Daniel's. Understanding this helped me understand why Christine controlled the money so tightly. She had been raised in a system where money was how you kept people, and she was replicating it. Third, I reached out to Daniel's friend Marcus. Marcus had been Daniel's closest friend from college, and one of the people Christine had slowly pushed to the margins. I hadn't spoken to Marcus in 2 years. I looked him up, found him on LinkedIn, sent him a message that said nothing more than that I'd been thinking about him, hoped he was, well, and that Daniel was lucky to have had a friend like him over the years. Marcus called me the next day. He said he'd been worried about Daniel for over a year. He said he'd tried reaching out 3 or 4 times and gotten polite but vague responses that didn't sound quite like Daniel. We talked for an hour. I told him what I was doing. He asked how he could help. I told him to keep reaching out low pressure, no agenda, just the ongoing message that he was still there. Fourth, I started writing things down. Not as evidence, not with any legal purpose in mind at that point. Just because I had learned over a career of infrastructure work that documentation protects you, that the things you've written down are the things you can stand behind, that memory is unreliable and records are not. I noted dates and incidents and direct quotes as well as I could reconstruct them. I did not share these with anyone. I kept them in a notebook in my desk drawer. Dr. Okafor reached out to Daniel in the second week of November, around the anniversary of Ruth's death. I don't know exactly what she said that was between them, as it should have been. But 2 weeks later, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual, and asked if he could come over. He arrived at my house around 7. He sat at my kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in as a teenager, doing homework while I made dinner. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He didn't say anything for a while. I made coffee. I put it in front of him, and I sat across from him, and I waited. He said, "Dad, I think something is wrong." I said, "I know. I've been here." He looked up at me, and there it was, the thing I'd been waiting for. The thing Dr. Okafor had told me to wait for. Not an accusation, not a decision, not even a plan. Just a crack in the wall he'd been building around himself. Just the first admission that the wall existed at all. We talked for 3 hours. I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't tell him what Christine was. I didn't tell him about the calls I'd made or the notes I'd kept or the things Phil had found. That wasn't what he needed that night. That night, he needed to talk, and I needed to listen. And I needed to be exactly the person I had always been to him. Not a rescuer, not a fixer, just his father, steady and present, and not going anywhere. Before he left, he said, "She's going to say, 'I've been talking to you behind her back.'" I said, "You've been talking to your father. You're allowed to do that." He nodded. He stood in my doorway for a moment, looking at the dark street, and said, "I missed Mom tonight." I said, "Me too. Every day." He drove home. I sat in my kitchen, and I allowed myself, for the first time since October, to feel the full weight of how frightened I had been. It took another 4 months. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect these stories to move faster than they do. They don't. Real change in a person who has been systematically diminished doesn't happen in one phone call or one conversation or one dramatic moment. It happens in increments. It happens in the accumulation of small recalibrations, each one adding a little more clarity, a little more volume back to the voice that's been turned down. Daniel started seeing Dr. Okafor again in December. He told Christine it was about processing grief around his mother's anniversary. That was true, it was about that. It was also about other things. Christine didn't like it, but she didn't stop it, probably because she hadn't yet identified it as a threat. Marcus started showing up again, just texts at first, then a lunch in January that Christine didn't know about, then more regular contact. Daniel told me Marcus felt like a missing piece he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. I kept my Tuesday lunches with my son. I kept my notes. I kept my patience, which was the hardest part I am, at my core. An engineer, and engineers want to fix things efficiently and on schedule, and this was a process that had its own timeline and would not be rushed. In late January, Daniel called me. On a Sunday morning, he said, "I need your help with something. I need to talk to someone about separating. Someone who can help me understand what I'm entitled to." I already had a name. I had, several months earlier quietly, without telling anyone, had a single consultation with a family law attorney in the county seat. Not because I was sure it would come to this, but because in my experience, when you suspect a structure may fail, you find out what the recovery options are before the failure happens, not after. I gave Daniel the attorney's name. I told him I would help him with anything he needed, that I would be there for whatever came next, and that the most important thing he had done in a long time was exactly what he was doing right now. The divorce was not simple. I didn't expect it to be. Christine's initial response was to try to frame the separation as Daniel's instability, his unresolved grief, his inappropriate dependence on his father, his inability to handle the pressures of a real adult relationship. She engaged her own attorney, and her father bankrolled an aggressive approach. There were accusations I won't detail here, none of which held up, because I had spent 4 months carefully not giving anyone anything to hold against me or my son. Glenn tried to call me once. He was different on the phone than he was at his dinner table, less of the big voice, more of the quiet threat. He said that Daniel was making a mistake he'd regret, that the family had resources, that this didn't have to become unpleasant. I said, "Glenn, I've been an engineer for 30 years. I know how load-bearing structures work. You've been putting too much weight on my son for too long, and the structure is correcting itself. I'd recommend stepping back." He hung up. Phil, at my request, had a conversation with his former colleagues in the county about the LLC structure and Glenn's business history. Not a formal investigation. Just a quiet conversation, the kind that leaves people aware they're being observed. Glenn became considerably less aggressive in his approach to the divorce proceedings within 2 weeks. The notebook I'd been keeping became, in one specific instance, genuinely useful not in court, but in a meeting with Daniel's attorney, where we needed to establish a timeline of events, and I could produce exact dates and quotes. The attorney said she wished more clients came in prepared that way. The financial situation was complicated because of how tightly Christine had controlled everything. But Daniel had been working, had been contributing to assets, and had an attorney who understood exactly how to document that. The process took 7 months from Daniel's initial filing to final decree. I will not pretend it was painless. It was not. There were nights Daniel slept on my couch because going back to that house, even knowing it was almost no longer his house, felt like more than he could do. There were mornings he sat at my kitchen table and didn't say anything for a long time. I made coffee. I sat across from him. I let the silence be what it needed to be. My son is doing well now. I want to say that plainly, because I know that's what you came here for. Not just the weight of what happened, but the knowledge that it ended in a place worth reaching. He lives in an apartment 20 minutes from me. He took the freelance writing project that he had mentioned at that October dinner table, the one Christine had silenced with a hand on his wrist. It turned into something larger, a steady side arrangement with a firm he respects, doing work he's genuinely good at. He has lunch with Marcus every couple of weeks. He calls me on Tuesday evenings usually, and sometimes just to tell me about something interesting he heard on the radio. He's in therapy still. He goes every other week. He says it helps him understand his own patterns, why he made the choices he made, what he wants to make sure he doesn't carry forward. He talks about his mother a lot in those sessions. He told me about what it meant to grow up watching her handle hard things with so much grace, and about the ways he'd internalized beliefs about love and sacrifice that didn't always serve him. I think about Ruth when he tells me those things. I think she would be so proud of him, not for leaving, for finding himself again on the other side of it, for deciding he deserved to take up the space he was owed. I still have the notebook. I haven't thrown it away. Not out of bitterness. I don't carry bitterness well. Never have. It makes me too slow. I keep it because it reminds me that documentation is protection, that patience is a form of action, that showing up steadily over time is one of the most powerful things a person can do for someone they love. Christine has moved back in with her parents, I'm told. Glenn's business had a difficult year. I can't say I'm sorry about either of those things, but I also didn't engineer them. I just made sure that the people who needed to be aware of certain information were aware of it, and I let consequences find their own way. That's the thing about load-bearing structures. You don't have to collapse them yourself. You just have to stop letting the wrong things bear the weight. I'm 63 years old. I have a bad knee and a good pension and a bird feeder I still haven't managed to fully squirrel-proof. I have Sunday dinners with my son about twice a month, and sometimes Marcus comes too, and we sit around my kitchen table and eat whatever I've made and talk about nothing in particular for a couple of hours. Last Sunday, before Daniel left, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Dad, thank you for all of it." I said, "You don't have to thank me. That's just what this is." He nodded. He knows what I mean. We both do. That's what it means to be someone's father. Not to fix everything, not to fight every battle, just to be there, steady and unchanged, so that when your son finally finds his way back to himself, he knows exactly where home is.